I am Maya, 34 years old, and I am the undisputed black sheep of my family. Last night, my phone buzzed with an image that would finally break the last thread of my patience. A confirmed booking for an $80,000 VIP suite on a Royal Caribbean cruise. My mother was taking my sister, her husband, and their son on the vacation of a lifetime. When I asked where my 8-year-old son Leo would be sleeping, my mother sent a voice note laughing. "There is not enough room for him," she said. "Take him to a theme park and do not ruin our vibe." I just smiled, set my phone down on my leather sofa, and prepared to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your peace from toxic family members who underestimate your worth. Growing up in a household where love was treated like a currency I could never afford, I learned early on to guard my heart. But nothing prepares you for the moment that coldness is deliberately directed at your child. It was a typical Sunday evening. I was sitting on the plush leather sofa in my living room, enjoying a quiet moment after putting Leo to bed. The soft ambient lighting reflected off the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment. I had poured myself a small glass of wine, ready to unwind before the start of a busy work week. Then my phone screen lit up. It was the family group chat. I usually kept it on mute because it was nothing more than a digital stage for my mother and sister to flaunt their lives, but tonight the notifications were coming in so fast they demanded my attention. I picked up the device and saw a massive high-resolution image dominating the screen. It was a digital brochure and a booking confirmation combined into one obnoxiously bright collage. A Royal Caribbean luxury cruise. But this was not just any standard ticket. This was the Royal Loft Suite, the kind of accommodation that features 2 floors of panoramic ocean views, a private dining room, a personal butler, and a balcony larger than most apartments. The price tag attached to the booking confirmation was clearly visible: $80,000. Right below the image was a long paragraph from my mother, Brenda. Her words practically vibrated with self-importance. She announced to the group that she was fully funding this dream vacation. She wrote about how much my younger sister Chloe deserved a break from her stressful life. Chloe is 30 years old, has never held a job for more than 6 months, and spends her days shopping. But to my mother, Chloe is the golden child who can do no wrong. Brenda then went on to praise Chad, Chloe's white husband. She called him a brilliant wealth manager who works tirelessly to provide for his family, and said this luxury cruise was the perfect setting for a man of his caliber to relax and network. Finally, she mentioned my nephew Mason, calling him the absolute light of her life, who was going to have the best time playing in the private jacuzzi. I read the message twice. I scanned the names again: Chloe, Chad, Mason. I scrolled up to the booking details: occupancy for 4 guests. I sat there in the quiet of my living room, the cool leather of the sofa grounding me as a familiar dull ache settled in my chest. It was the exact same feeling I used to get when I was a teenager, watching my mother buy Chloe expensive pageant dresses while handing me old clothes from the thrift store. But this time, it was not about me. It was about Leo. My sweet, intelligent 8-year-old boy, who had just brought home a perfect report card. Leo, who had spent the entire weekend helping me bake cookies and talking about how much he wanted to see the ocean. I took a deep breath, keeping my fingers steady, as I typed a single simple question into the chat. What about a ticket for Leo? I hit send and watched the screen. The group chat fell completely silent. The rapid-fire notifications stopped instantly. 1 minute passed, then 2 minutes. I could see the typing bubbles appear and disappear. I knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes. They were frantically calling each other, irritated that I had dared to point out the glaring omission in their perfect family portrait. They were annoyed that I was forcing them to acknowledge the child they had deliberately chosen to leave behind. Finally, a single voice note appeared in the chat. It was from my mother. I did not even raise the phone to my ear. I pressed play and let the audio fill the silent room. Brenda's voice was sharp-coded in that condescending tone she reserved exclusively for me. "Maya," she sighed as if my very existence was exhausting her. "There just is not enough room for him. The suite only holds 4 people, and we are already at maximum capacity. Besides, a luxury environment like this really is not the place for a boy like Leo. You know how he can be. We just want an elegant, relaxing trip without any disruptions. Why do you not just take him to a local theme park or a public pool or something? Just figure it out. And please do not make a scene and ruin the vibe for the rest of us. The audio cut off. Do not ruin the vibe. She had just casually dismissed her own grandson, labeling him a disruption, while spending $80,000 to treat her golden child and her supposedly wealthy son-in-law to a life of absolute luxury. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. I looked at the phone, then looked toward the hallway leading to Leo's bedroom. A fierce protective anger ignited deep in my stomach, burning away any lingering desire I had for my mother's approval. She had crossed the final line. Before I could even fully process the absolute cruelty of my mother dismissing her own grandson as a disruption, my phone vibrated again. The group chat was not done with me yet. A new text bubble popped up, this time from Chad. Chad is my sister Chloe's husband, a white man who works as a mid-tier wealth manager. Ever since he married into our family, my mother has treated him like absolute royalty. He walks around family gatherings with an unbearable sense of superiority, constantly offering unsolicited financial advice, and speaking to me as if I am a charity case. I stared at the screen and read his message. It was a long, meticulously typed paragraph, dripping with condescension. Maya, let us be realistic here, he wrote. You are a single mother working a basic administrative job. You simply do not have the disposable income to participate in this tier of luxury. Having children you cannot afford is a choice, and expecting us to subsidize a vacation for a hyperactive 8-year-old is entirely unreasonable. Maybe instead of being bitter and trying to guilt-trip your mother, you should focus on finding yourself a wealth manager, husband like me, who can actually elevate your lifestyle. Until then, step aside and let Mason enjoy the fruits of our labor. Do not project your own financial insecurities onto our luxury trip. Immediately underneath his essay, Chloe chimed in. She sent 5 crying, laughing emojis, followed by a short, stinging text. Exactly what Chad said. Sorry, sis, but not everyone is built for the high life. Leave the luxury to those who actually know how to handle it. You and Leo have fun at the public pool. I did not type a single word back. I did not defend my choices. I did not curse them out, and I certainly did not defend my son to people who were committed to misunderstanding his worth. When you argue with fools, you only end up looking like one yourself. Instead, I simply pressed the power button on the side of my phone, turning the screen black, and tossed it onto the coffee table. I stood up from the sofa. The silence of my apartment wrapped around me, a sharp contrast to the loud, obnoxious energy radiating from that group chat. I took a slow walk across my living room. My home is a sprawling penthouse overlooking the magnificent Chicago skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows offer an uninterrupted view of the city lights shimmering against the dark waters of Lake Michigan. Every piece of furniture in this space was custom designed. The rich mahogany floors, the imported Italian leather seating, the curated modern art hanging on the walls. This is what true wealth looks like. It is quiet. It is private. It does not need to scream its net worth in a family text thread. Chad genuinely believes he is the pinnacle of success because he drives a leased European car and manages minor investment portfolios for local dentists. He has absolutely no idea that I am the shadow chief executive officer of a massive venture capital firm. My company funds and scales minority-owned businesses across the country. We manage hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. In fact, my firm actually owns the commercial high-rise building where Chad rents his cramped office space. To them, I am just a quiet single mom in plain clothes. I keep my life completely private because my peace is worth far more than their validation. I walked over to my custom-built home bar. I reached past the standard bottles and pulled down a rare aged Kentucky bourbon. I dropped a single large ice cube into a heavy crystal glass and poured the amber liquid. The satisfying clink of the ice and the rich smoky aroma of the bourbon instantly grounded me. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through my chest. The anger that had ignited in my stomach just moments ago was rapidly transforming into cold, calculated focus. With the glass of bourbon in my hand, I walked into my home office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of the city outside. I sat down at my desk, which is a solid slab of reclaimed walnut, and opened my laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a blue light across my face. I opened a secure browser window and navigated to my enterprise banking portal. My mind went back to the screenshot my mother had so proudly sent to the group chat. The booking confirmation for the Royal Loft Suite. In her rush to brag about the $80,000 price tag and the VIP status, she had forgotten to crop the image. At the very bottom of the receipt, it clearly displayed the last four digits of the credit card used for the transaction. 4012. I knew those numbers. They did not belong to my mother's personal checking account. They certainly did not belong to Chad's heavily leveraged bank accounts. A few weeks ago, my mother had stopped by my apartment unannounced, claiming she wanted to drop off some old childhood photos. I had left my wallet on the kitchen island while I took an urgent business call in the other room. I knew she was nosy, but I never imagined she would cross the line into actual theft. She must have snooped through my wallet and written down the details of the sleek black card she found tucked in the back slot. She probably assumed it was just a personal credit card with a high limit, thinking she could max it out, pay the minimums, and force me to deal with the debt. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password and bypassed the two-factor authentication. The corporate dashboard loaded onto the screen, displaying a series of multi-million-dollar accounts. I navigated to the executive expense section and clicked on the transaction history for the backup corporate purchasing card. I took another sip of my bourbon and smirked. There it was, right at the top of the pending transactions list. A charge for $80,450 authorized to Royal Caribbean International. What my arrogant brother-in-law and my entitled mother did not know was that the black card they had just swiped for their dream vacation was not a personal credit card at all. It was my company's backup corporate card, an account monitored closely by federal financial regulations and my very aggressive accounting department. They thought they were flexing their superior wealth. In reality, they had just committed corporate wire fraud. The sheer audacity of it all was almost impressive. My mother, a woman who has spent her entire life judging the moral character of everyone around her, had seamlessly transitioned into a white-collar criminal just to impress her favorite child. She had taken a card that did not belong to her and authorized an $80,000 charge for a luxury suite, fully believing that there would be zero consequences. She likely thought it was just another one of my personal credit cards. She has always assumed I am drowning in debt because I refuse to buy designer clothes or flashy cars. In her mind, she was just adding to my imaginary financial burden, a burden she felt I deserved for not being as successful as her precious son-in-law. But this card was tied directly to the primary operating account of my venture capital firm. We manage investments across 3 continents. The compliance protocols on these accounts are not handled by a standard customer service representative. They are monitored by a dedicated corporate security team and flagged for federal compliance. By forging my signature or using my billing details, Chad and Brenda had crossed a line that separated petty family drama from a federal offense. I moved my wireless mouse across the smooth walnut surface of my desk. The cursor hovered over the red button that read "Cancel Transaction." It would have been so incredibly easy to click it. If I pressed that button, the payment would reverse immediately. Royal Caribbean would send a cancellation email to my mother within 5 minutes. Their dream vacation would evaporate before they even had the chance to buy a bottle of sunscreen. They would throw a tantrum in the group chat, blame me for ruining their lives, and then move on to their next scam. But where is the justice in that? If I stopped them now, they would never truly understand the weight of what they had done. They needed to feel the anticipation. They needed to spend the next few weeks bragging to their neighbors, their church friends, and Chad's mediocre clients. I wanted Chloe to go out and max out her own credit cards buying those $2,000 sundresses and oversized designer sunglasses she was boasting about. I wanted them to pack their bags, drive to the port in Miami, and walk onto that massive ship feeling like absolute royalty. I wanted them to taste the luxury they felt so entitled to. And then, right when they were miles out into the middle of the ocean, completely disconnected from reality, I would let the floor drop out from underneath them. I moved the cursor away from the Cancel Transaction button. Instead, I navigated to the Security tab. I selected the option to report cards stolen. A prompt appeared on the screen asking if I wanted to freeze all associated accounts and initiate a fraud investigation. I checked the box. I then clicked on a secondary setting: Freeze International Transactions. This was the brilliant part. The initial $80,000 payment for the suite had already cleared the preliminary authorization. The cruise line had their money for now. But the moment Chad or my mother tried to use that card for anything else, whether it was a bottle of champagne on the deck, a spa treatment, or a designer watch in the ship's duty-free boutique, the transaction would instantly trigger a hard decline and alert maritime security. I clicked Confirm. The screen flashed a bright red alert acknowledging the lockdown. The trap was officially set. The digital net had been cast and they were swimming right into it, completely blinded by their own arrogance. I leaned back in my chair, picking up my glass of bourbon. I took a long, slow sip, letting the silence of my penthouse wash over me once again. For the first time all evening, the anger in my chest was completely gone. It was replaced by a deep, absolute sense of calm. The kind of calm that only comes from knowing you hold all the cards and the people playing against you do not even realize the game has started. I was just about to close my laptop and head to bed when a new notification slid across the top right corner of my screen. It was an email from my executive assistant, Sarah. Sarah is a meticulous professional who handles my private wealth and legal matters with absolute precision. She knows I do not like to be disturbed on a Sunday night unless it is an absolute emergency. The subject line was written in bold capital letters: Urgent. Suspicious mortgage loan alert on trust property. I set my glass down, the ice clinking sharply against the crystal. I clicked on the email and opened the attached file. It was an automated alert from the county clerk's office forwarded through our legal department. Someone had just successfully initiated a home equity line of credit, commonly known as a HELOC, against a residential property located in Atlanta. A property that had been placed into my private trust 3 years ago. The property belonged to my late grandmother, who we all affectionately called Big Mama. This was not just any piece of real estate. Big Mama's house was the cornerstone of our family history. It was a beautiful, sprawling home that she had worked her entire life to pay off. When she passed away, my mother had nearly lost it to foreclosure due to her own financial incompetence. I had quietly stepped in, paid off the remaining debt, and legally transferred the deed into an ironclad trust under my name to protect it. My mother was allowed to live there rent-free, but she had absolutely no legal authority to borrow against it. Yet here I was looking at a legally binding document that stated otherwise. I read the details of the loan application. The requested cash-out amount was exactly $100,000. My eyes scanned down to the bottom of the digital document looking for the beneficiary. The funds were slated to be transferred into a limited liability company, an LLC registered to Chad. The sheer scale of the betrayal began to fully materialize in front of me. The cruise ticket was just the tip of the iceberg. Chad and my mother were not just stealing from my credit card to go on a vacation. They were actively forging documents and mortgaging my private real estate behind my back to fund his failing business. The audacity to use the home that my grandmother built from the ground up to finance their lavish lifestyle was disgusting. I scrolled back up to the top of the screen and stared at the red alert still flashing on my banking portal. I let out a low, dark chuckle that echoed in the empty room. It seemed the fun was not going to stop at a frozen credit card after all. The trap I had just set for the cruise was merely a warm-up. They wanted to play a high-stakes game with federal wire fraud and forged property deeds. I was going to make sure they lost everything. To truly understand the sheer magnitude of their delusion, you have to look back at exactly what happened just 1 week ago. I sat staring at the forged mortgage documents on my laptop screen, my mind flashing back to our traditional family Sunday dinner. It was held at that very same property, Big Mama's house, a place that now legally belonged to me but was still occupied by my mother. As soon as Leo and I had walked through the front door that afternoon, the toxic atmosphere hit me like a physical wall. The air in the house was thick with pretense and unearned arrogance. Chloe and Chad were already holding court in the living room. Chloe was practically shoving her new quilted designer handbag into the face of anyone who walked by. She bragged loudly about how Chad had surprised her with it just because it was a Tuesday. She twirled around in her expensive heels, complaining about how exhausting it was to keep her massive closet organized. Chad stood next to her with his chest puffed out, swirling a glass of cheap wine like it was a rare vintage. He was wearing a tailored suit to a casual Sunday family dinner, which told you absolutely everything you needed to know about his crippling need for validation. Throughout the entire afternoon, Chad would not stop name-dropping his supposedly elite clients. He talked over everyone, dominating the conversation with financial buzzwords that he clearly did not fully understand. He boasted about managing million-dollar portfolios and making aggressive market moves that the average person simply could not comprehend. I remember sitting quietly on the couch sipping a glass of water and watching him perform. Even then, before I knew a single thing about the forged loan, I could smell the desperation on him. True wealth does not have to announce itself. True wealth does not need to wear a three-piece suit to eat pot roast in a suburban living room. The real cruelty started when we finally sat down at the dining table. My mother had prepared a massive spread featuring a beautiful prime rib roast as the centerpiece. Brenda stood at the head of the table, carving the meat with a bright, performative smile. When it came time to serve the plates, she made her priorities abundantly clear. She cut the thickest, most tender slices of the prime rib and placed them directly onto Chad and Chloe's plates. Then she carved an equally generous portion for Mason, my 7-year-old nephew, cooing over how a growing boy needed his high-quality protein to stay strong. When she reached Leo, her entire demeanor shifted. Her warm smile vanished, replaced by a tight, irritated line. She scraped the bottom of the roasting pan, picking out the tough, overcooked end pieces and dropping them carelessly onto my son's plate. She then piled a mountain of boiled, unseasoned vegetables next to the dry scraps of meat. "Eat your vegetables, Leo," she snapped, without even looking him in the eye. "Do not be picky. Mason is such a good eater. You should really learn from him and stop being so difficult." I watched my sweet boy look down at his plate, his little shoulders slumping in defeat. The blatant favoritism was sharp and intentional. It was designed to make me react, to make me look like the angry, bitter sister. But I did not cause a scene. I did not yell or argue with a woman committed to misunderstanding my child. I simply picked up my fork, calmly reached over to the center serving platter, and took 2 prime, perfect cuts of meat. I placed them directly over the burnt scraps on Leo's plate, kissed his forehead, and whispered to him that we would go get his favorite ice cream on the way home. My mother glared at me, her jaw clenching so hard I thought her teeth might crack, but she did not say a single word. She knew better than to push me when I had that completely blank look in my eye. The dinner continued with more insufferable bragging from the golden couple. They practically talked over each other, competing to see who could sound more excited about the upcoming luxury cruise. But then, as Chad was eagerly discussing the logistics of the trip, his mask slipped. Chloe had been whining loudly about sitting in premium economy for the flight down to Miami. She wanted to know why her wealthy husband had not booked them in the first-class cabin. Chad sighed loudly, his face flushing slightly red. He waved his hand dismissively, avoiding eye contact with the table. He told her they just had to deal with the premium economy seats because he was temporarily liquid poor. He claimed all his cash was tied up in aggressive offshore investments and he simply could not liquidate the funds in time to cover the exorbitant first-class upgrades. He used all the right corporate jargon to make it sound like a brilliant strategic move rather than a financial failure. Temporarily, liquid poor. The phrase had echoed in my mind all week. Now sitting in the dark of my home office and staring at the federal fraud alert on my computer, the puzzle pieces snapped perfectly into place. Chad was not liquid poor because of brilliant offshore investments. He was dead broke. He was drowning. He was so deeply in debt that he had resorted to stealing his mother-in-law's home equity just to keep his wife in designer bags and fund a luxury vacation they had absolutely no business taking. My mother had happily handed over the keys to her kingdom, completely unaware that she was financing her own destruction. And tomorrow they were going to board a ship to nowhere. But the absolute peak of that Sunday dinner, the moment that truly sealed their fate, happened just minutes after Chad made his pathetic excuse about being liquid poor. Chloe had crossed her arms, clearly still agitated that she would not be sipping champagne in the first-class cabin. To Chloe, appearances are everything, and flying anything less than first class is a personal tragedy. Sensing her golden child's distress, my mother immediately swooped in to save the day and protect Chad's fragile ego. Brenda placed her fork down on her expensive china plate. She wiped the corners of her mouth with a cloth napkin, sat up perfectly straight, and puffed out her chest. She looked around the table with a smug, self-satisfied expression that I will never forget. "Do not worry about the flights, Chloe," my mother announced, her voice booming through the dining room. "Your husband is a financial genius. Sometimes you have to temporarily tie up your cash to make the big moves. And as a family, we support those big moves. That is why I took the initiative to unlock some of our generational wealth." The entire table went quiet. Even Chad looked a little stiff, his eyes darting quickly toward me before snapping back to his plate. My mother smiled brightly, oblivious to the sudden tension. She proudly proclaimed that she had gone to the bank earlier that week and taken out a home equity line of credit on Big Mama's house. She boasted that she had leveraged the property to secure $100,000 in pure liquid cash. She then happily explained that she had transferred the entire amount directly into Chad's business account, so he could invest it in a highly lucrative commercial real estate fund. According to her, Chad was going to double that money in 6 months, and the $80,000 cruise was simply a well-deserved advance on their guaranteed profits. I stopped chewing my food. My fork hovered frozen halfway between my plate and my mouth. The ambient noise of the room, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of the air conditioning, everything seemed to fade away into a sharp, ringing silence. My eyes locked directly onto my mother. But Brenda was on a roll, completely unaware of the massive bomb she had just detonated. Having praised her own incredible generosity, she immediately pivoted to her favorite pastime, which is belittling me. She turned her sharp gaze in my direction, her smile twisting into a sneer. "Take notes, Maya," she said, pointing a manicured finger at me. "This is what family does. We build wealth together. We support each other. Chad is actively building an empire for this family, while you sit there contributing absolutely nothing. You have lived your entire life taking up space. You work a dead-end administrative job, you rent an apartment, and you have never once offered to help this family financially. You are perfectly fine eating the food on my table, but when it comes to bringing real value, you are completely useless." She went on, her voice rising with righteous indignation. She told me that maybe if I had listened to her instead of being so stubborn, I would not be struggling as a single mother. She said that while Chloe was out here thriving and securing a future for her son, I was a prime example of wasted potential. She practically spat the words at me, doing all of this right in front of my 8-year-old son. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I just stared at her with a cold, piercing intensity that made her shift uncomfortably in her chair for a split second before she regained her haughty posture. She thought my silence was the silence of a defeated woman. She thought I was humiliated, speechless, because she had finally put me in my place. She thought she had won. She had absolutely no idea why my blood had actually run cold. It was not because of her insults. I had built up an immunity to her verbal abuse years ago. I froze because my brain was rapidly processing a terrifying legal impossibility. 3 years ago, Brenda had fallen victim to a massive online scam. She had drained her retirement accounts and taken out predatory loans to cover her losses. She kept it a secret from everyone, especially her precious golden child Chloe, until the bank served her with a foreclosure notice. She was exactly 30 days away from losing Big Mama's house forever. In a panic, she came crying to me, begging for help. I did not give her cash because I knew she would just squander it. Instead, I had my corporate attorneys intervene. I paid off the massive arrears in full, satisfied the debt, and saved the property. But I did not do it blindly. To protect my grandmother's legacy from my mother's financial incompetence, I had the legal deed of the house transferred entirely out of her name. The property was placed into a secure private trust, a trust that I solely control. My mother was legally allowed to reside in the house for the rest of her life rent-free. But she was just a tenant. She possessed zero legal equity. She had absolutely no ownership rights. So as I sat at that dining table looking at the smug faces of my mother and my brother-in-law, one single glaring question echoed in my mind. How do you take out a $100,000 home equity line of credit on a piece of real estate that you do not own? The answer hit me with the force of a freight train. A bank does not simply hand over a massive sum of cash without a title search and a signature from the legal property owner. For that loan to be approved, the bank needed the signature of the trustee. They needed my signature. I looked at Chad. His knuckles were white as he gripped his wine glass. He knew. He knew exactly what he had done. My mother, in her staggering ignorance, thought she was making a brilliant financial maneuver. But Chad was a wealth manager. He understood the law. He had taken advantage of her desperation to fund his failing lifestyle, and in the process he had forged my signature on federal bank documents. He had committed felony wire fraud and identity theft. And tomorrow this absolute fool was getting on a boat into international waters. I pulled myself out of that memory and brought my focus back to the glowing screen in my darkened home office. The anger I felt at that Sunday dinner was nothing compared to the cold and surgical precision that was taking over my mind right now. I needed absolute proof. I needed every single piece of the paper trail before I made my next move. I immediately logged into the county clerk public records database. Since the property was held in a trust, any lien or encumbrance recorded against the deed would be a matter of public record, even if the internal bank documents were private. I typed in the address for Big Mama House. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a frantic but controlled energy. Within seconds, a new document popped up under the property history. It was recorded just 4 days ago, a home equity line of credit agreement. I paid the small digital fee to download the full file. As the pages loaded onto my screen, my eyes bypassed the standard banking clauses and scrolled directly to the final page. The signature page. There, sitting right above the printed name of my private trust, was my signature, or at least an incredibly desperate attempt at it. I zoomed in on the screen to examine the ink strokes. The loops were slightly too wide, the pressure of the pen was uneven, and the slant was completely wrong. It was a flawless forgery to an untrained bank teller or an automated system, but to me, it was a glaring and undeniable fake. Chad had likely found an old birthday card or a piece of mail I had signed at the house. He copied it and then used his professional credentials as a licensed wealth manager to push the paperwork through a friendly contact at his bank. He bypassed the standard identity verification protocols by leveraging his industry status and his close relationship with my mother. But forging the signature was only half of the crime. I needed to see exactly where the money went. I forwarded the document to my executive assistant Sarah, who was clearly still online monitoring the alerts. I asked her to trace the wire. Within 10 minutes, she used our firm investigative resources to pull the routing details associated with the loan disbursement. She sent me back a secure encrypted file. I opened the file and read the name of the receiving account. The money did not go to a high-yield commercial real estate fund. It did not go to an exclusive offshore investment portfolio like Chad had bragged about at the dinner table. The $100,000 was wired directly into a regional bank account registered to a domestic limited liability company. I opened another tab and cross-referenced the company name with the state business registry. The sole registered agent and managing member of that company was Chad. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, staring at his name in bold black letters on my monitor. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was absolutely staggering. For years, my mother had paraded Chad around as the gold standard of success. She constantly praised his white-collar pedigree, treating his mere presence in our family as a massive elevation of our social status. He was the brilliant man who was supposed to rescue Chloe from a life of mediocrity. He looked down his nose at me, mocking my administrative job and my quiet lifestyle, telling me I needed to find a man like him to upgrade my life. Meanwhile, his entire empire was built on a foundation of sand and stolen equity. He was not a financial genius. He was a fraudster. He was a cheap con artist hiding inside a tailored suit. Big Mama had worked as a housekeeper for 30 years to buy that house. She scrubbed floors and broke her back so her family could own a piece of property free and clear. Chad, a privileged man who thought he was entitled to the world, had stolen decades of my grandmother's blood and sweat with a single stroke of a pen. He had manipulated my mother perfectly to get it done. He knew Brenda was desperate for validation and terrified of losing her wealthy image. He knew she would never question his complicated financial jargon. So he convinced her to risk the only roof over her head to fund his sinking ship. He probably told her that the paperwork was just a standard formality, a simple signature required to unlock their generational wealth. And my mother, completely blinded by her obsession with her golden child and her perfect son-in-law, handed him the keys to the castle without a second thought. She had essentially helped him steal from her own family just to keep up appearances. I took a deep breath, the reality of the situation settling heavily over me. This was no longer just a toxic family dispute over a dinner table. It was no longer just about an $80,000 cruise ticket bought with a stolen corporate card. This was felony wire fraud. This was identity theft across state lines. Chad had used electronic communications to execute a scheme to defraud a federally insured financial institution. That is a massive federal crime that carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. He thought he had outsmarted the black sheep of the family. He thought I was too poor and too ignorant to ever find out what he had done to my trust. He thought he could steal my property, exclude my son, and sail off into the sunset on my dime. But he had just handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to destroy his entire life. The trap was no longer just about a frozen credit card. It was about federal prison. I smiled. A genuine cold smile that stretched across my face as I looked up from the glowing monitor of my laptop. My eyes drifted slowly across the quiet elegance of my home office and landed on a silver-framed family portrait sitting on my mahogany bookshelf. It was taken 5 years ago during a Christmas gathering. My mother was standing dead center, practically beaming with pride, her arms wrapped tightly around Chloe and Chad. I was pushed to the far left edge of the frame, holding a toddler-sized Leo, looking more like a hired nanny, who had accidentally wandered into the shot than a member of the actual bloodline. They looked so perfect in that photograph, so incredibly untouchable. Calling the local police precinct would be the standard expected response for someone who had just discovered a forged mortgage document. A couple of uniformed patrol officers would eventually knock on the front door of Big Mama's house, ask a few uncomfortable questions, and write up a standard incident report. My mother would inevitably cry and play the victim. Chad would immediately hire a cheap, aggressive defense lawyer, and they would drag the entire ordeal out in local civil court for years. They would spin the narrative, claiming it was just a simple familial misunderstanding over estate planning. I was not going to give them that luxury. Local police simply do not have the resources to handle multi-state corporate wire fraud and federal banking violations with the speed and severity that I required. So I picked up my phone and bypassed local law enforcement entirely. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and called Marcus, Marcus is the lead litigation partner at the powerhouse corporate law firm that represents my venture capital company. He is a legal shark in a bespoke suit, a man who thrives on dismantling financial criminals and protecting high net worth assets. Even though it was nearly midnight on a Sunday, he answered on the second ring. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I simply told him to log into our secure server and review the file I had just uploaded. I sat back in my chair and listened to his steady breathing on the other end of the line as he read through the forged equity documents, the trust deed, and the wire transfer receipts that Sarah had uncovered. When he finally spoke, his voice was razor sharp. He confirmed exactly what I already knew. Chad had just committed a textbook Title 18 United States Code Section 1343 violation: wire fraud. Marcus immediately asked me if I wanted him to file an emergency civil injunction in the morning to freeze all of Chad's domestic assets. I told him no. I told him a civil injunction was a slap on the wrist. I wanted a criminal indictment, and I wanted it coordinated directly with his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus understood the assignment immediately. Through our firm's extensive dealings in corporate acquisitions and international finance, we maintain a direct line to the FBI's White-Collar Crimes Division in Chicago. I instructed Marcus to hand over the entire digital paper trail: the forged signatures, the IP addresses used to initiate the electronic transfers, the shell company registration documents, and the specific routing numbers. I wanted the federal agents to have a perfectly wrapped gift box of irrefutable evidence. But I gave Marcus one very specific non-negotiable condition. They could not execute the arrest warrant or freeze Chad's bank accounts until Thursday afternoon. Thursday was the exact day my mother, my sister, and her fraudulent husband were scheduled to set sail from the port of Miami. If we stopped them now while they were still packing their designer luggage in the comfort of Big Mama's house, they would have a chance to control the fallout. They would call our extended family and play the victims. Chloe would cry on social media about how her jealous, bitter older sister ruined their dream vacation over a clerical banking error. Chad would invent some convoluted financial excuse to save face. I was not going to allow them to control the story. I wanted them to experience the absolute peak of their fake, glamorous lives before the reality of federal prison brought them crashing down. I wanted them to board that massive luxury liner. I wanted them to unpack their expensive resort wear in that $80,000 VIP suite. I wanted them to post their heavily filtered photos on Instagram, bragging to their hundreds of superficial followers about their elite status. I wanted them to sail completely out of United States jurisdiction and deep into international waters. Out there, surrounded by the ocean, there would be nowhere to run. There would be no friendly local bank manager to cover Chad's tracks. When my corporate credit card was officially flagged for theft and the federal indictment hit, the Wire Maritime Security would have absolute authority. I wanted the FBI and international authorities waiting to seize his passport the moment they hit their first foreign port. I wanted their humiliation to be as public and spectacular as the arrogance they had shown me and my son. The next few days were an exercise in supreme calculated patience. I went to work. I took Leo to his favorite museum. I watched the family group chat light up with endless frantic updates about their packing and their first-class travel plans to Florida. I did not say a single word. I just let them talk. On Thursday morning, Chloe posted a live video from the Miami cruise terminal. She was wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat, holding a glass of complimentary champagne, and leaning against Chad, who was wearing designer sunglasses and smiling like he owned the entire world. My mother was in the background waving frantically at the camera, completely oblivious to the fact that the house she was returning to was already slated for legal seizure. I sat at my desk in Chicago, watching the video loop, feeling the vibration of my phone as Marcus texted me a single word: approved. The federal asset freeze was officially active. Through the screen of my phone, I watched the live broadcast as the massive floating city of a cruise ship began to pull away from the dock. The incredibly loud, deep sound of the ship's horn blew through the speakers, echoing across the Miami port and signaling their departure into the open sea. They were drinking champagne and cheering, completely unaware that the ladder had just been pulled away. Their dream vacation had officially begun, but their absolute worst nightmare was waiting for them on the other side of the ocean. The ship was gone, and with it the toxic weight that had hung over my life for years. Back in Chicago, I had a promise to keep. I held Leo's hand as we walked through the heavy brass-framed glass doors of one of the most exclusive three-star Michelin steakhouses in the city. The maitre d' immediately recognized me, greeting me by my first name and respectfully ushering us past the crowded waiting area. He guided us to a private, deeply cushioned leather booth tucked away in a quiet, warmly lit corner of the main dining floor. Leo's eyes were wide with absolute wonder, taking in the crystal chandeliers and the immaculate white tablecloths. This dinner was his reward for bringing home a flawless report card. I wanted him to experience the exact kind of premium service, respect, and luxury that my mother and sister had so casually declared he was not worthy of. A waiter in a crisp white jacket immediately brought over a beautifully crafted mocktail for Leo and a glass of rare vintage red wine for me. We ordered the A5 Japanese Wagyu beef truffle-infused mashed potatoes and fire-roasted asparagus. There were no prices listed on the menu I was handed. That is the reality of true quiet wealth. You do not need to look at the price tag because your presence in the room already dictates that you belong there. While we waited for our appetizers, my phone, which was resting face down on the table, began to vibrate. It was not a single buzz. It was a low, continuous vibration that signaled a massive influx of activity. I flipped the device over and saw a barrage of Instagram notifications flooding my lock screen. Chloe had just started a live broadcast, and my mother was tagging my inactive social media accounts in the comments. With a calm, detached curiosity, I tapped the notification and entered the live stream as a silent, anonymous viewer. The screen instantly filled with Chloe's face. She was wearing massive, oversized designer sunglasses, a wide-brimmed straw hat, and a sheer luxury cover-up over her swimsuit. She was spinning around the lower level of the Royal Loft suite, holding her phone high in the air to capture every single angle of the opulent room. "Welcome to the high life, babes," she squealed to her audience of a few hundred followers. "This is what generational wealth looks like. Eat your heart out." She walked past the private dining table and stepped out onto the sweeping balcony. The bright, blinding sun of the Caribbean Sea reflected off the pristine blue water behind her. The camera panned over to Chad. He was leaning casually against the edge of their private jacuzzi, wearing a linen shirt completely unbuttoned to his chest. He was holding a freshly popped bottle of extremely expensive champagne, pouring it carelessly into a crystal flute. He raised the glass to the camera and gave a smug, heavily practiced wink. "Work hard, play hard," Chad said smoothly, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "When you manage million-dollar portfolios and make the right aggressive market moves, you have to treat your family to the absolute best." The sheer, blinding irony of his statement almost made me laugh out loud right there in the restaurant. He was flexing a lifestyle entirely funded by federal wire fraud, forged property deeds, and my stolen corporate credit card. He was giving financial advice to the internet while actively committing a felony. Then my mother stepped into the video frame. Brenda was holding a mimosa, looking incredibly pleased with herself. She leaned into the camera, her eyes narrowing slightly as she spoke directly to Chloe's followers. "We are just so incredibly blessed," Brenda announced, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive venom. "It is such a shame Maya could not make it. But honestly, she is probably sitting in her cramped apartment eating canned beans right now. We all make our choices in life, and some of us just choose to succeed." Chloe burst into a high-pitched giggle, reading the comments from her friends validating their toxic behavior. I watched the screen for another moment, studying their desperate need for external validation before quietly exiting the live stream. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I looked up just as the waiter arrived, carefully placing a sizzling, perfectly seared cut of Wagyu beef in front of Leo. My son's face lit up with pure joy as the rich aroma filled the space around us. Canned beans, I thought to myself, taking a slow sip of my wine. The contrast between my quiet, peaceful reality and their loud, desperate illusion was absolute poetry. They were spending their evening performing for strangers on the internet, terrified of looking poor, desperately trying to convince the world that they mattered. I was spending my evening completely present with my brilliant son, knowing with absolute certainty that I held the power to end their entire performance with a single phone call. I watched Leo take his first bite of the incredibly tender steak, a massive smile spreading across his face, and I knew I had made the exact right decision to let them sail away. We took our time finishing the incredible meal. Leo was happily working his way through a towering, elaborate chocolate dessert, and I was just signaling the waiter to bring the check, preparing to hand him my actual fully active black card. Suddenly, the peaceful ambiance of our private booth was shattered. My phone did not just vibrate with another petty Instagram notification. It began to ring with an aggressive, continuous tone. It was a FaceTime call. The caller ID flashed Chloe's name in bright, demanding letters. I let it ring 3 times. I took one last unhurried bite of my steak, wiped my mouth with the cloth napkin, and finally swiped the green answer button. The video feed connected, but the background was no longer the sunny, sweeping balcony of the royal loft suite. The bright, natural lighting and the ocean breeze were completely gone. Instead, the background was filled with the sharp, brilliant glare of glass display cases and harsh overhead spotlights. It was the ship's exclusive duty-free Cartier boutique. And Chloe was no longer laughing. Her designer sunglasses were pushed up onto her head, tangling in her hair. Her face was completely drained of color, her makeup looking suddenly pale and hollow under the boutique lights. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic, and she was breathing heavily as if she had forgotten how to pull air into her lungs. The high life had officially reached its expiration date. I stared at the screen, my expression completely neutral, as I slowly chewed a perfectly tender piece of Wagyu beef. The ambient jazz music of the steakhouse played softly in the background, a soothing soundtrack that contrasted sharply with the chaotic, breathless noises coming from my phone speaker. Chloe did not even bother to say hello. She did not ask how I was doing or how her nephew was enjoying his evening. She just started screaming. "Maya!" she yelled, her voice cracking with a high-pitched hysteria that made a few diners at the adjacent tables glance in my direction. "You need to call the bank right now. Something is completely messed up. Mom's card just declined." I leaned my phone against the crystal water glass on the table, giving myself a hands-free view of her complete and utter meltdown. "Declined," I repeated flatly. "That is strange. I thought Mom had plenty of generational wealth to unlock for her favorite child." Chloe shook her head violently, completely ignoring my sarcasm. Her oversized designer sunglasses were now pushed up onto her head, tangling awkwardly in her blonde extensions. "No, you do not understand. We are in the Cartier boutique on the promenade deck. Chad was trying to buy me an anniversary present to kick off the trip. It is a $20,000 watch." The manager ran Mom's card and the machine literally locked up. It flashed a code red fraud alert, and now the merchant system will not even return the physical piece of plastic. The machine swallowed it, Maya. I took another small bite of my steak, chewing slowly and deliberately. "And what about Chad?" I asked, feigning innocent confusion. "Why did he not just pay for it? He is a wealth manager, right? Surely a $20,000 watch is just pocket change for a man of his incredible caliber." Chloe let out a frantic, humiliating sob. The camera shook violently as her hands trembled. "He tried. Of course he tried. He pulled out his platinum card, but it declined too. Then he tried his debit card, his backup credit cards, everything. Every single piece of plastic in his wallet was rejected. The boutique manager said his accounts are showing up as completely frozen. They are talking about federal flags, Maya. They said his name is on an international block list. She panned the camera slightly to the left, giving me a full view of the nightmare unfolding inside the boutique. I could see Chad in the background, the smug, unearned confidence he had displayed on the live stream just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. His tailored linen resort wear suddenly looked completely ridiculous on him. He was sweating profusely, his face pale and shining under the harsh halogen lights of the jewelry store. He was arguing with a stern-faced security guard who was physically blocking the glass exit doors. Chad was gesturing wildly, pulling up banking applications on his phone, desperately refreshing screens that were undoubtedly showing zero available balances and locked-out error messages. My mother was sitting on a velvet display chair near the jewelry counters. She was holding her face in her hands, looking like she was going to pass out. Two half-empty crystal flutes of complimentary champagne sat on the glass counter next to the velvet box containing the $20,000 watch they could not afford. The illusion of their absolute superiority was disintegrating in real time, and I had a front-row seat to the show. Chloe brought the phone back to her face. Tears were now ruining her perfect, expensive makeup, leaving dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. "They are not letting us leave," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute terror. "They already wrapped the watch and rang up the champagne we drank while we were shopping." The manager called maritime security. "They are holding us inside the store until the balance is settled or the authorities arrive to escort us away. You have to fix this. Call whatever administrative hotline you use at your little office and wire some money to my account right now." The sheer audacity of her demand was almost beautiful. Here she was trapped in a luxury boutique on a floating city in the middle of the ocean surrounded by security guards, and her instinct was still to order me around. She still viewed me as the family servant, the useless sister who existed solely to absorb their messes and fix their mistakes. She genuinely believed she could insult me on a public livestream, call me a bitter woman, eating canned beans, and then demand a $20,000 wire transfer, exactly 10 minutes later. The entitlement was so deeply ingrained in her bones that she could not even comprehend her own hypocrisy. I picked up my crisp white cloth napkin from my lap. I gracefully wiped the corners of my mouth, taking my time letting the heavy silence stretch out across the digital connection until Chloe looked like she was going to have a heart attack. I set the napkin down on the pristine white tablecloth. I reached for my glass of vintage red wine and took a long, deliberate sip, savoring the complex flavors while she hyperventilated on the other end of the line. "You want me to fix this?" I asked, my voice deadly calm, completely stripped of any sisterly affection. "You want the sister who sits in a cramped apartment eating canned beans to magically produce $20,000 for a Cartier watch." Chloe blinked, her mouth dropping open as she realized I had watched her entire live stream. Her arrogant facade finally crumbled, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated panic. "Maya, please," she begged, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "This is an emergency. People are staring at us through the glass windows. Do not be spiteful right now." I smiled, but the warmth did not reach my eyes. I leaned closer to the phone screen, making sure she could see the absolute lack of mercy on my face. "Why are you asking your useless sister, Chloe? Tell your millionaire husband to swipe his black card." Chloe stared at me through the screen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The sheer shock of my refusal had completely paralyzed her. She was so accustomed to me bending to the family's will that she genuinely did not possess the cognitive ability to process the word no. Before she could even stammer out a response, a large sweaty hand reached into the frame and violently snatched the phone away from her. The camera tumbled wildly for a second, capturing a dizzying blur of the boutique's crystal chandeliers and armed security guards, before finally settling on Chad's face. He looked absolutely horrific. The suave, untouchable wealth manager who had been popping champagne on the luxury deck just minutes ago was completely gone. His face was the color of spoiled milk. Sweat beaded across his forehead and gathered uncomfortably on his upper lip. His breathing was heavy and ragged, making the camera shake with every inhalation. Yet despite his obvious terror, he still tried to wear his mask of authority. He tried to look down his nose at me through the lens, attempting to summon that familiar, condescending tone he always used at our Sunday dinners. "Listen to me very carefully," Maya Chad barked, his voice tight and strained. "This is not the time for your petty sibling rivalry. Stop playing games with your sister and listen to instructions. I need you to log into your banking app right now and wire $20,000 to my checking account. Actually, make it 30,000. I need a cushion for the rest of the trip until I can sort this out with my wealth management firm back in the States." I did not move. I did not blink. I simply sat there in the plush leather booth of the Chicago steakhouse, my phone propped up against my water glass. The camera angle from my end was steady, capturing me perfectly framed against the elegant, dimly lit restaurant. If a cinematographer were filming this moment, the camera would be tracking slowly in a continuous circle around me, establishing my absolute dominance over the situation. I was entirely at peace. I was a woman holding the executioner's axe, and the condemned man was barking orders at me from the chopping block. I tilted my head slightly, studying his panicked features. "And why would I do that, Chad?" I asked smoothly. "Why on earth would I wire $30,000 to a man who just told the entire internet that he manages million-dollar portfolios? Did your aggressive market moves suddenly bounce?" Chad ground his teeth together so hard I could almost hear the enamel cracking through the phone speaker. "This is a massive clerical error," he hissed, glancing nervously over his shoulder at the boutique manager who was now speaking quietly into a security radio. "My bank is being completely ridiculous. I called my private client line and the representative told me all my domestic accounts have been frozen pending some sort of federal fraud investigation. It is a total misunderstanding. One of my high net worth clients probably flagged a massive wire transfer by mistake, and the system automatically locked everything down as a precaution. It happens all the time in high level finance. You would not understand because you just do administrative work. Now stop asking stupid questions and send the wire. I will pay you back double when the hold is lifted on Monday." The sheer audacity of his lies was breathtaking. Even while backed into a corner, completely humiliated in front of strangers, he was still trying to insult my intelligence. He was still desperately clinging to the illusion that he was the smartest person in the room. "Federal fraud investigation," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "That sounds incredibly serious, Chad. I work in an office, sure, but even I know that the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not just freeze a wealth manager's entire financial portfolio over a simple clerical error. They do not initiate an international hold on your passport and lock down your credit cards unless they have absolute undeniable proof of a felony." Chad slammed his free hand down on the glass display case in front of him. The loud smack made Chloe scream in the background, and a security guard immediately stepped forward, placing a firm hand on the hilt of his radio. Chad flinched, stepping back, his false bravado crumbling by the second. "Do not lecture me about finance, Maya," he spat, his voice dropping to a frantic, desperate whisper. "You have absolutely no idea how the real world works. Family is supposed to help family. If you do not wire this money right now, they are going to escort us off this ship at the next port. Chloe is having a panic attack. Your mother is crying. Do you really want to be responsible for ruining this family?" I picked up my glass of vintage red wine and took a long, luxurious sip. I swallowed, enjoying the rich, complex finish, completely unbothered by his emotional blackmail. "I am not ruining this family, Chad. I am simply letting the consequences of your own actions catch up to you." "What are you even talking about?" he demanded, his eyes darting frantically around the boutique. "I do not have time for your cryptic nonsense. Send the money." I leaned forward. I rested my elbows on the pristine white tablecloth and brought my face closer to the phone. The ambient noise of the steakhouse seemed to fade away completely, leaving only the sharp electric tension between us. I dropped my voice to a low, dark octave, the kind of voice that leaves absolutely no room for misunderstanding. "Hey, Chad," I said softly. He stopped breathing. He stared at the screen, a primal, animalistic fear suddenly flashing in his eyes as the tone of my voice registered in his brain. "Do you know what the federal sentencing guidelines are for forging a signature on a home equity line of credit loan?" The silence that followed was absolute. Chad completely froze. He did not blink. He did not breathe. The phone in his hand trembled so violently that the image on my screen became a blur. The color completely drained from his already pale face, leaving him looking like a literal corpse standing under the bright lights of the Cartier store. In that single suspended second, he finally realized two terrifying truths. I knew exactly what he had done to Big Mama's house. And the federal fraud investigation locking him inside that boutique was not a clerical error. It was me. I watched the realization hit him in real time. His eyes widened, his pupils dilating under the harsh boutique lights, as the weight of my words crushed whatever remained of his manufactured ego. For a man who made a living selling illusions confronting cold, hard reality was clearly a system shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He just stood there clutching the phone with trembling fingers, looking absolutely pathetic. I shifted my gaze away from his terrified eyes on the screen. I looked at the table in front of me, admiring the rich ruby color of the vintage red wine resting in my crystal glass. I reached out my fingers, wrapping elegantly around the delicate stem, and lifted it to the light. The steakhouse was filled with the gentle hum of wealthy patrons enjoying their evening, the soft clinking of silverware and the low notes of a jazz piano. It was an atmosphere of true quiet luxury, entirely disconnected from the absolute destruction I was orchestrating from my corner booth. It was the perfect setting for an execution. "You thought you were so incredibly clever, Chad," I said smoothly, bringing my attention back to his frozen face on the screen. "You thought you could manipulate a desperate, gullible woman into mortgaging her own home to bail out your failing business. You probably told Mom it was just a standard line of credit to unlock her generational wealth, and she was foolish enough to believe you. But here is the problem with your brilliant little scheme. Mom does not own Big Mama House. She has not owned it for 3 years." In the background of the video feed, I saw my mother snap her head up. She dropped her hands from her tear-stained face, her eyes locking onto the back of Chad. "What is she talking about?" Brenda demanded, her voice shrill and trembling, completely ignoring the security guards watching them. "Chad, what does she mean I do not own the house?" Chad ignored her. He was staring at me, his breathing shallow and rapid. I took a slow sip of my wine and continued my lesson in property law. When Mom almost lost the house to foreclosure 3 years ago because of her own financial incompetence, I stepped in. I paid off the massive debt she had accumulated, but I did not just hand the keys back to her so she could ruin our family legacy again. I had my attorneys transfer the deed entirely into a private trust, a trust that I solely control. She is legally nothing more than a tenant living there rent-free. She possesses zero equity. Chloe let out a loud, confused gasp. "But the bank approved the loan," she protested, stepping into the frame next to Chad. "The bank gave us $100,000 in cash. How could they do that if Mom does not own the property?" I smiled at my sister, feeling a deep, satisfying thrill as I connected the final dots for her. "Because your husband did not use Mom and her signature on the federal loan documents, Chloe. He forged mine." The silence in the Cartier boutique was deafening. Even the security guards seemed to hold their breath, sensing the gravity of the confession playing out in front of them. Chloe slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Chad could not even meet her eyes. He was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched, looking like a cornered animal. "I pulled the county clerk records yesterday," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly through the phone speaker. "I saw my forged signature on the home equity line of credit. I saw the wire transfer routing numbers. I know exactly which regional bank account the $100,000 was deposited into. I tracked it straight to the domestic limited liability company registered solely in your name. You did not invest that money offshore. You stole it to pay off your mounting debts and fund a lifestyle you cannot afford. You are a complete fraud." Chad finally looked up, his face contorted in a desperate mix of rage and terror. "Maya, please," he rasped, his voice cracking under the pressure. "We can work this out privately. I can liquidate some assets. I can pay the trust back with interest. Do not do this to the family. I let out a low, dark chuckle. Work this out, I echoed. You think we are going to sit down at the next Sunday dinner and negotiate a payment plan for felony identity theft? You really do not understand the magnitude of the mistake you made. I did not call the local police precinct, Chad. I bypassed the local authorities completely. I sent the forged deeds, the wire routing numbers, and your shell company registry directly to my corporate attorneys and the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He stumbled backward, hitting the glass display case behind him. The boutique manager gasped, but Chad did not even notice. That is exactly why your accounts are frozen, I continued ruthlessly. The federal government locked down every single domestic asset tied to your name. Your bank accounts, your investment portfolios, your firm operating capital. It is all gone. The feds are currently tearing through your business records in Chicago, and my lawyers are preparing to seize whatever crumbs you have left to restore the stolen equity to my trust. You are not a wealth manager anymore, Chad. You are a federal suspect facing 20 years in prison for wire fraud. My mother wailed in the background, a loud theatrical sound of pure despair as she realized the golden son-in-law she had worshipped was actually the architect of her ruin. Chloe began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as the reality of her husband and his crimes washed over her. Her perfect life was disintegrating on live camera. But Chad, I am not even finished yet, I said softly, leaning closer to the phone. I saved the absolute best part for last. He looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant, a man completely broken. You see, I could have stopped you before you ever boarded that ship. I could have let the FBI arrest you in your driveway, but I wanted you to get on that boat. I wanted you to sail out into international waters. Do you remember that sleek black card you and Mom found in my wallet? The one you used to book that $80,000 Royal Loft suite? Chad swallowed hard, a fresh wave of panic washing over his pale face, as his mind struggled to catch up with my trap. You thought it was just a personal credit card? I smiled, my voice dripping with satisfaction. You thought you could max it out and leave me with the bill. But that card belongs to the primary operating account of my venture capital firm. It is monitored by corporate security. And last night, right after you sent those lovely insults in the group chat, I reported it stolen. I flagged every transaction for corporate fraud. That means the down payment for your luxury suite was made with a stolen corporate card. I paused, letting the absolute horror of his situation sink in deep into his bones. You are standing in a jewelry store on a luxury ship in the middle of the ocean. You have no money. Your accounts are seized by the federal government. And you are traveling on a ticket flagged for corporate theft. Oh, by the way, that $80,000 VIP ticket was bought using my stolen corporate card. Have fun when maritime security knocks on your door. Before he could utter a single pleading word, I pressed the red button and ended the call. The screen went black, cutting off Chad's terrified face and the chaotic background of the boutique. I set the phone face down on the pristine white tablecloth. I picked up my fork and took another bite of my steak, chewing slowly, letting the absolute silence of my victory settle over me. For a fleeting moment, I thought that was the end of it. I thought they would finally understand that they were completely out of options, but I had underestimated my mother's boundless capacity for delusion. Less than 10 seconds later, my phone began to ring again. It vibrated violently against the table, the screen flashing with Chloe's name. I let it ring. I watched the screen light up the dimly lit booth. It stopped, then immediately started ringing again. They were desperate. I reached out, swiped the screen, and answered the video call, propping the phone back against my water glass. It was not Chad this time, and it was not Chloe. It was my mother. Brenda had clearly snatched the phone the moment the previous call dropped. The background had shifted slightly. It looked like the boutique manager had forced them into a private, windowless viewing room in the back of the store to keep their humiliating breakdown away from the wealthy patrons on the promenade deck. The walls behind her were lined with dark velvet panels, creating a claustrophobic, dramatic backdrop for her meltdown. My mother's face filled the screen. The carefully constructed, elegant persona she had paraded around all week was entirely shattered. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup was smudged, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, feral energy. If a camera were capturing this moment from my perspective, it would push in tight on my stoic, unmoving face as the sheer volume of her verbal abuse poured through the speaker. "Maya," she screamed, her voice echoing harshly in the small back room. "What is wrong with you? Are you completely out of your mind? How dare you do this to us?" I did not flinch. I just stared at her, my expression completely blank, letting her dig her own grave. "You are a venomous snake." Brenda spat, her face turning a deep, angry shade of red. "You have always been jealous of your sister. You have always been bitter that Chad is a successful man while you are sitting around as a single mother. You set this up. You trapped us on purpose just to embarrass us in front of all these important people. You are trying to destroy this family out of pure spite." It was fascinating to watch her brain work. Even now, with the irrefutable proof of Chad's felony wire fraud staring her right in the face, she was still desperately trying to spin the narrative. She could not accept that her golden son-in-law was a criminal. She could not accept that her perfect family was a sham. So she did what she had done my entire life. She made me the villain. I raised an eyebrow, my voice barely above a whisper. "I forced Chad to forge my signature on federal bank documents, Mom. Did I force you to steal a corporate credit card out of my wallet, too?" Brenda waved her hand frantically, completely dismissing the actual crimes. "That is just paperwork, Maya. That is just technicalities. I am your mother. I raised you. I put clothes on your back and fed you when you were a child. If I needed to unlock some equity from that house to help our family, I had every right to do so. It does not matter whose name is on a piece of paper. You owe me. You owe this family. And you are going to call whoever you need to call right now and fix this." Her absolute refusal to take accountability was staggering. She genuinely believed that giving birth to me gave her a lifelong, irrevocable pass to steal from me. When her anger failed to get a reaction out of me, I watched her pivot to her second tactic: manipulation. The aggressive screaming stopped, and suddenly her eyes filled with thick, manufactured tears. Her voice dropped to a trembling, fragile pitch. "Maya, please," she whimpered, pressing her hand against her chest. "I am your mother. I love you. We are blood. You cannot do this to us. You cannot send the father of your nephew to federal prison. Think of Mason. Think of what this will do to Chloe. She will be ruined. We are trapped in this tiny room. The security guards are treating us like common criminals, and they are threatening to lock Chad in the ship's holding cell. You have to save us." She leaned closer to the camera, her tear-streaked face desperate and pleading. "Just call the bank. Call your lawyers. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them you authorized the loan and the credit card charges. Do it for me, Maya. I am begging you. Show some motherly love. Do not destroy our lives over a stupid grudge. Save our face on this luxury ship, and I promise we will pay you back every single penny when we get home." I looked at her. I looked deep into the eyes of the woman who had spent 34 years making me feel like I was completely worthless. The woman who had proudly declared that my brilliant, sweet son was a disruption and refused to make room for him on a family vacation. She was invoking motherly love to protect a white-collar criminal while actively ignoring the fact that she had shown absolutely zero love to her own grandson. The last remaining thread of obligation I felt toward this woman quietly snapped. I felt lighter than I had in years. I leaned forward, my face perfectly calm, my voice coated in absolute ice. "Your motherly love cost $100,000, and a cruise ticket that did not include my son," I said, pronouncing every single word with terrifying clarity. "It is too late." Brenda's mouth opened in a silent scream of despair, but before she could formulate another lie, a massive echoing sound erupted through the phone speaker. It was the sound of heavy, aggressive pounding on the thick door of the boutique's private viewing room. "Open the door," a deep, authoritative voice boomed from the other side. "Maritime security. We have a federal warrant for Chad's arrest. Open the door immediately, or we will breach it." The panic in the room hit an absolute fever pitch. Chloe began to shriek uncontrollably. Chad could be heard sobbing loudly in the background, begging them not to open the door. My mother stared at the camera, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it almost looked comical. "Enjoy the rest of your vacation, Mom," I whispered. I reached out and pressed the red button, ending the call for the final time. I ended the call, the screen going black, and set my phone down on the pristine white tablecloth. I picked up my fork and took a slow, deliberate bite of my perfectly seared steak. But I knew the show was not completely over. Chloe is a woman who lives her entire life for an audience. Earlier, before she called me in a blind panic to demand money, she had been broadcasting live to her hundreds of followers on social media. In her absolute hysteria to FaceTime me, she had not closed the application. She had simply swiped it to the background. When my call disconnected, her phone defaulted right back to the active live stream. I tapped the glowing purple ring around her profile picture, entering the broadcast, as a silent observer once again. The visual was absolute chaos. Chloe must have dropped the device in sheer terror the moment our FaceTime ended, because the camera was tumbling wildly. The screen flashed with dizzying blurs of dark velvet walls, bright halogen lights, and the terrified faces of my family before the phone finally hit the carpeted floor of the boutique with a loud thud. It landed face up, the camera lens angled sharply upward from the ground, creating a shaky, distorted handheld documentary feel to the nightmare that was unfolding. Through the speaker, I heard the heavy mahogany door of the private viewing room fly open. It was a violent, explosive crash that made my mother scream. 4 pairs of heavy tactical boots rushed into the camera frame. They belonged to the ship's maritime security team, followed closely by 2 men in plainclothes displaying international law enforcement badges. Chad, a deep, authoritative voice, boomed over the audio, reading his full legal name. "Step away from the women and place your hands flat against the glass display case. Do it right now." From the skewed angle on the floor, I could see the bottom half of Chad trying to back away. The arrogant wealth manager was completely gone. He was stammering, his voice cracking like a terrified child. "Wait, there is a massive misunderstanding," Chad pleaded, his hands visibly shaking as they entered the frame. "I am a VIP guest. I am a licensed financial professional in the United States. You cannot just burst in here like this. Let me call my firm." The officers did not care about his firm. They did not care about his tailored linen resort wear or his VIP status. 2 large security guards moved in instantly. They grabbed Chad by the shoulders, spun him around with a force that made him gasp, and slammed him chest first against the velvet-paneled wall. The sharp, heavy metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed perfectly through the phone speaker. It was the sweetest sound I had heard all week. "You are being detained under an international red notice issued by the Federal Bureau of Investigation," the lead officer announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You are facing federal charges for multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft. All of your domestic and international assets have been seized by the United States government. You are a flight risk, and you are officially under arrest." My mother let out a horrific, guttural wail. Her expensive high heels stumbled into the frame as she tried to physically step between the armed officers and her precious son-in-law. "Do you know who we are?" Brenda shrieked, her voice completely unhinged. "He is a millionaire. He manages elite portfolios. You are making a terrible mistake, and I demand to speak to the captain of this ship." A security guard placed a firm, immovable hand on her shoulder, physically pushing her back. "Ma'am, I suggest you lower your voice and step back," the guard warned sharply. "Your entire booking was processed using a stolen corporate credit card. You are no longer considered guests on this vessel. You are trespassing." Chloe's legs dropped into the frame. She had literally collapsed onto the floor of the boutique. She was sobbing so violently that she could barely catch her breath. Her hands scrambled across the carpet, eventually grabbing the phone. As she picked it up, the camera shook violently, capturing a close-up of her ruined makeup, her tangled blonde extensions, and her completely destroyed pride. She held the phone against her chest, the lens capturing a shaky, chaotic view of the room as the officers pulled Chad to his feet. The chief of security looked directly at my mother and my weeping sister. "You will be escorted back to the royal loft suite by armed guards," he ordered. "You have exactly 1 hour to pack your belongings. You will be confined to your quarters under strict guard until we reach the nearest port in Monaco. At that point, you will be formally removed from this ship and handed over to local authorities. Now move." They grabbed Chad by the arms and began to march him out of the back room. Chloe stumbled to her feet, the phone still clutched in her shaking hand, broadcasting every single humiliating second to the internet. As the security detail pushed them through the glass doors of the Cartier boutique and out onto the ship's grand promenade deck, the true magnitude of their nightmare was finally revealed. The commotion had drawn a massive crowd. Hundreds of ultra-wealthy passengers, the exact elite demographic that Chad and Chloe had spent the entire day trying to impress, were lined up along the balconies and walkways. The promenade was bathed in brilliant golden light, making it impossible to hide. Every single passenger had stopped what they were doing, and almost every single one of them had their smartphone out. The camera feed shook wildly as Chloe looked around. I could hear the whispers and the mocking laughter from the crowd. I heard a woman's voice clearly say, "Is not that the guy who was bragging about buying everyone champagne earlier?" Another voice laughed. "I heard his credit card bounced and he is a total fraud." Flashbulbs went off as people recorded the supposed millionaire being walked in handcuffs by maritime police. Chloe let out a devastating sob. She reached out, clinging desperately to the arm of one of the security guards, begging him to cover her face, begging the wealthy crowd to please stop filming them. But no one stopped. They just kept recording the absolute destruction of her perfect life. I watched the screen with a profound sense of satisfaction. If a camera were following me right now, it would be a slow, steady tracking shot capturing the complete peace on my face as I sat in that quiet, warmly lit steakhouse booth. I took another sip of my wine, my eyes locked on the chaotic live feed playing out on the phone Chloe had dropped on the floor. The contrast was magnificent. I was surrounded by genuine luxury, eating an exquisite meal with my brilliant son, while my toxic family was staging a public circus on a cruise ship they never had the right to board. The security guards were pushing Chad down the grand promenade, trying to move the spectacle away from the luxury boutiques. But Chad suddenly stopped. The polished, unbothered persona he had worn for years completely shattered. The immense pressure of the handcuffs digging into his wrists, the glaring lights, and the mocking laughter from the wealthy bystanders finally broke him. Backed into a corner, with absolutely no way out, the real Chad emerged. And he was vicious. He violently twisted his upper body, ignoring the security guards yelling at him to keep moving. He locked his wild, terrified eyes onto Chloe, who was stumbling behind him, still weeping uncontrollably. "You did this to me!" Chad screamed, his voice echoing loudly across the grand atrium. His face was a dark, furious purple. "You and your endless, pathetic need to look rich." Chloe froze, her hands flying to her mouth. "Chad, what are you saying?" she sobbed, her voice trembling. "I am saying you are a gold digger who dug us straight into a federal prison," he roared, completely ignoring the dozens of cell phones recording his every word. "Do not stand there crying like a victim. You knew we were struggling. I told you we could not afford this lifestyle. But no, you had to have the $2,000 designer bags. You had to have the first-class tickets. You had to flex on Instagram for a bunch of strangers who do not even care if you live or die. You bled me dry, Chloe. You forced me into massive debt just so you could pretend you were better than everyone else." The crowd of onlookers let out a collective gasp. The brutal honesty of his confession was cutting through the manufactured glamour of the cruise ship like a knife. Chloe staggered backward, completely devastated. Her entire identity, her carefully curated image as the pampered wife of an elite wealth manager, was being violently ripped apart in front of a live audience. "How dare you speak to my daughter that way?" my mother shrieked, suddenly pushing her way past a security guard. Brenda was trembling with rage, her expensive resort wear looking wrinkled and ridiculous as she marched up to the son-in-law she had worshipped for years. "You are a fraud, Chad. You manipulated us. You stole from my family to cover up your own failures." Chad threw his head back and let out a harsh, manic laugh that bordered on completely unhinged. "Your family," he spat, turning his venomous glare onto Brenda. "You are just as pathetic as she is. You are a gullible old fool, Brenda. Do you really think I had to work hard to manipulate you? You practically handed me the deed to that house on a silver platter. You were so desperate to brag to your little church friends about your brilliant white son-in-law that you did not even bother to read the paperwork. You gave away your own mother's legacy just to feed your massive ego." The air in the atrium seemed to get sucked out of the room. Brenda stood completely paralyzed. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. For her entire life, my mother had operated under the delusion that she was the smartest, most sophisticated woman in any room. To be publicly exposed as a foolish, easily manipulated pawn by the very man she had placed on a pedestal was the ultimate destruction of her pride. She let out a sound that was half scream, half growl. Without a single second of hesitation, Brenda lunged forward. She raised her right hand and slapped Chad across the face with a force that echoed sharply through the massive atrium. The sharp crack of skin against skin made the security guards jump. Chad stumbled sideways from the impact, his head snapping back. Before the guards could restrain her, Chloe suddenly snapped out of her shock and lunged at Chad too, screaming hysterically and hitting his chest with her fists. The perfect superior family that had spent years looking down on me and my son was now physically brawling in the middle of a luxury cruise ship. They were tearing each other apart violently, turning on one another like cornered animals fighting over scraps. The security detail quickly multiplied. More guards rushed into the frame, blowing whistles and shouting orders. Two massive officers grabbed Brenda by the arms, dragging her backward, while she kicked and screamed obscenities at Chad. Another officer physically picked Chloe up off the floor, pulling her away from her husband while she thrashed wildly. Chad was pushed hard against a decorative marble pillar, a guard holding him firmly by the back of his neck to keep him immobilized. I watched the viewer count on Chloe's dropped phone. It was rapidly climbing, hitting several thousand viewers, as the algorithm picked up the chaotic live stream. But that was not even the most damaging part. Through the camera lens, I could see the bystanders lining the balconies of the atrium. They were not just watching, they were actively broadcasting. Teenagers and young adults were holding their phones up, narrating the brawl. The footage was being instantly live-streamed on TikTok to millions of potential viewers. The hashtag cruise ship drama was probably already trending. The humiliation was absolute, permanent, and entirely public. I picked up my phone, gently ending my viewing session of Chloe's live stream. The screen went dark, returning me to the peaceful reality of my own life. The screaming faded away, replaced once again by the soft jazz piano of the steakhouse. I looked across the table at Leo, who was happily finishing the last bite of his chocolate dessert, completely oblivious to the justice that had just been served. The family that had tried to throw us away had just thrown themselves into a fire they could never extinguish. I looked away from the dark screen of my phone, and a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The chaotic livestream had been abruptly terminated by the ship's security team, cutting off the feed just as my mother and sister were being dragged away from their public brawl. I picked up my wine glass one last time, taking a final celebratory sip before signaling the waiter for the check. I handed him my perfectly active, fully funded black card. The transaction was approved instantly. I tipped him generously, took my son by the hand, and walked out of the restaurant into the cool, crisp Chicago night air. I went home, tucked Leo into his warm bed, and slept more peacefully than I had in my entire life. I did not toss and turn. I did not worry about the family I was leaving behind. I slept with the deep, unshakable comfort of a woman who had finally excised a toxic tumor from her life. While I was resting in my penthouse, my mother, my sister, and her fraudulent husband were living through the longest night of their miserable lives. They were not allowed to enjoy the sweeping balcony or the private jacuzzi of their $80,000 suite. The ship's security team had marched them back to their room, locked the doors from the outside, and stationed 2 armed guards in the hallway. They were given a stack of cardboard boxes and ordered to pack their belongings. I can only imagine the suffocating tension in that room. The furious accusations, the bitter tears, the absolute terror of a fake millionaire realizing he had finally run out of lies. The next morning, the sun rose over the Chicago skyline, casting a beautiful golden light across my living room. I was standing in my kitchen wearing a comfortable silk robe, brewing a fresh pot of artisanal coffee. 7 time zones away, it was early afternoon in Europe, and the luxury cruise ship was finally making its unscheduled stop. But they did not dock at the glamorous, sun-drenched harbor of Monaco, where billionaires park their mega yachts. The maritime authorities had diverted the vessel to a small, gritty commercial port on the coast of Italy to process the federal fugitive on board. There was no grand farewell for the Golden family. There were no smiling staff members handing out tropical drinks as they disembarked. Instead, they were escorted out through the lower decks, marching past the engine rooms and the laundry facilities. They were paraded down a steep, narrow crew gangway made of industrial steel. The harsh Italian afternoon sun beat down on them mercilessly. My mother was still wearing the wrinkled remnants of the resort wear she had fought in the night before. Chloe was dragging Mason by the hand, her face swollen and red from hours of hysterical crying. Chad walked in front of them, his hands still securely locked in heavy metal handcuffs. When they reached the bottom of the gangway, they stepped onto the rough, unforgiving concrete of the commercial dock. The ship's crew did not gently load their bags onto a luxury transport vehicle. They simply tossed the heavy, oversized designer luggage right onto the dirty ground. The expensive leather trunks landed with loud, heavy thuds, kicking up small clouds of industrial dust. The sheer indignity of it was a masterpiece. They had boarded that ship expecting to be treated like royalty, and they were being thrown out like absolute garbage. Standing on the dock, waiting for them, was a contingent of local Italian police officers, flanked by 2 serious-looking men in dark suits representing international authorities. They spoke rapidly in Italian, communicating with the ship's security chief before turning their attention to Chad. One of the men in a dark suit stepped forward, holding out a thick manila folder containing the federal red notice. He spoke in heavily accented English, informing Chad that his United States passport was being officially confiscated on behalf of the federal government. Chad tried to argue, his voice weak and raspy from screaming the night before. He pleaded with the officers, explaining that he needed his passport to get back to his firm and clear up this massive misunderstanding. The officer simply shook his head, unaffected by the pathetic display. He reached into the front pocket of Chad's confiscated belongings, pulled out the navy blue passport booklet, and slipped it into an evidence bag. The officer calmly explained that Chad was grounded. He was not allowed to leave the local municipality, let alone board an international flight. He was trapped in a foreign country, completely stripped of his mobility, waiting for the grueling process of formal extradition back to the United States, where a federal prison cell had his name on it. The reality of the situation crashed down on Chloe with devastating force. She stood on the dirty concrete, looking around at the shipping containers and the armed guards. She realized she was stranded in rural Italy with a traumatized child, a weeping mother, and a husband facing 2 decades behind bars. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her wallet. It was filled with platinum credit cards, gold debit cards, and VIP access passes. But not a single piece of that plastic worked. The federal freeze had completely scorched their financial earth. They had absolutely zero liquid cash. They could not hail a taxi. They could not book a cheap motel room. They could not even buy a bottle of water from a vending machine. Back in my quiet, sunlit kitchen in Chicago, I poured my hot coffee into a ceramic mug. I leaned against the marble counter, enjoying the rich, roasted aroma. My phone, which was resting on the kitchen island, suddenly lit up. The screen flashed, accompanied by the standard default ringtone. It was an international audio call. The caller ID displayed Chloe's name. I stood there holding my warm mug of coffee, watching the screen illuminate the dark marble. I did not need to answer to know exactly what was happening on the other end. I could practically hear the desperate, ragged sobbing through the silent glass of my phone. I knew she was standing on that blistering hot concrete, staring at her useless luggage, begging the universe for a miracle. I knew she was calling to demand that her useless older sister wire them cash, buy them plane tickets, and fix the catastrophic mess they had created. She wanted me to rescue them from the very consequences I had orchestrated. The phone vibrated across the counter, buzzing with the frantic, pathetic desperation of a woman who had finally run out of victims to manipulate. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The flavor was bold, dark, and incredibly satisfying. I reached out with my free hand, hovered my finger over the screen for a fraction of a second, and firmly pressed the red decline button. The ringing stopped instantly. I locked the screen, turned my back on the phone, and walked away. I walked away from the kitchen island, leaving the silenced phone resting on the cool marble. The frantic, vibrating energy of my sister's desperation was completely cut off, replaced by the deep, comforting silence of my penthouse. I took my ceramic mug and poured the rest of my artisanal coffee down the stainless steel sink. I had established my boundary and the universe felt remarkably peaceful. But my work was not quite finished. The federal government was handling Chad and his international wire fraud, but I still had a massive loose end to tie up right here in Chicago. I walked into my bedroom and changed into a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal blazer and matching trousers. It was the kind of quiet luxury armor I wore when it was time to finalize a hostile corporate takeover. Today, the hostile takeover was deeply personal. I drove my SUV through the bustling morning traffic, heading straight for the sleek glass skyscraper that housed my corporate legal team. Marcus was already waiting for me in the main conference room, a thick stack of manila folders resting on the polished oak table in front of him. Marcus did not waste any time with small talk. He opened the primary folder and slid a heavy, legally binding document across the table. It was the original trust agreement I had drafted 3 years ago when I saved Big Mama's house from my mother's impending foreclosure. We sat down and reviewed the specific stipulations I had insisted upon to protect the estate. The clauses were absolutely ironclad. Brenda was granted a lifetime tenancy rent-free under the strict and legally binding condition that she maintain the property and never attempted to leverage, encumber, or sell the estate. By conspiring with Chad to take out a $100,000 home equity line of credit, even using a forged signature, she had explicitly violated the foundational terms of her residency. If a camera were filming this moment, it would execute a slow, deliberate push in tightening the frame on my face as I picked up the official notice to vacate. I held the crisp white paper in my hands, reading the bold legal jargon that effectively stripped my mother of her kingdom. There was no hesitation in my chest. There was no lingering guilt about family loyalty. I picked up a heavy sterling silver pen from the table and signed my name on the bottom line with absolute precision, officially executing the eviction. An hour later, I pulled into the familiar suburban driveway of Big Mama's house. I was not alone. I had brought Marcus a private process server and a professional commercial locksmith. The street was quiet, the manicured lawns perfectly still under the midday sun. My mother's nosy neighbors, the ones she constantly tried to impress with fabricated stories about her wealthy white son-in-law, were undoubtedly peeking through their blinds. They were probably wondering why a team of men in suits was marching up the front walk to Brenda's pristine front porch. I stood to the side and watched as the locksmith pulled out a heavy-duty drill and aimed it straight at the brass deadbolt. The loud grinding noise of the drill chewing through the metal felt incredibly symbolic. I was violently breaking the final lock my mother had on my life. Within 10 minutes, the old hardware was completely removed, and a brand new high-security electronic system was installed in its place. I held the new master key in my palm, feeling the cold, heavy weight of absolute ownership. I stepped inside the house, leaving Marcus and his team on the porch. The air inside felt stale, heavy with the lingering scent of my mother's expensive, overpowering perfume and the faint trace of Chad's cheap cologne. I walked through the living room, passing the ostentatious tacky furniture Brenda had bought on credit just to make herself look rich. I walked past the massive dining room table, where just 1 week ago they had mocked my son, fed him burnt scraps of meat, and paraded their stolen equity like a trophy. Big Mama had traveled from the deep south during the Great Migration with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. She had scrubbed floors until her knees bled. She had endured the absolute worst of society, saving every single penny in a tin coffee can hidden under her mattress just to carve out a tiny piece of the American dream for her descendants. She meant for this house to be a sanctuary. She meant for it to be a foundation of Black generational wealth, to protect us from a world that was already designed to keep us down. My mother had taken that sacred sacrifice and handed it over to a white-collar criminal just so she could brag at her Sunday church service. She had weaponized our family legacy for cheap social currency. I was not just evicting a toxic tenant today. I was actively rescuing my grandmother's legacy from a woman who did not respect the blood, sweat, and tears it took to build it. I walked back out to the front porch and pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The new electronic deadbolt engaged with a loud final click that echoed across the quiet street. The private process server stepped forward holding a roll of heavy-duty industrial tape. He took the official legal eviction notice, the one bearing my fresh signature and the bright red stamp of the county court, and taped it dead center on the front door. It was impossible to miss. I stood back on the front walkway and looked at the bright white paper contrasting against the dark wood of the door. Thousands of miles away, my mother, my sister, and Chad were currently sitting on a blistering hot concrete dock in rural Italy. They were completely stripped of their money, their credit cards, their passports, and their false pride. They were likely scrambling in a total panic, begging distant relatives for wire transfers, crying to the American embassy, desperately trying to find a way to crawl back to the safety of the United States. But what they did not know, the absolute final nail in the coffin of their arrogance, was that their return flight would bring them no comfort. The ultimate payoff was waiting for them, right here on this porch. The villains were not just humiliated on a global stage in Europe. When they eventually managed to scrape together enough pity to return to Chicago, they would find their keys useless, their belongings boxed up in a storage unit, and a legal notice barring them from the premises, under threat of arrest. They were officially homeless. Exactly 1 month later, the dust had finally settled, and the sheer scale of the destruction they had brought upon themselves was absolute. If you were to walk into my life right now, the camera would execute a slow, smooth tracking shot, gliding effortlessly through my expansive corner office in downtown Chicago. The morning sun pours through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, casting a warm golden glow over the sleek, modern furniture and the towering stacks of multi-million-dollar acquisition files sitting on my desk. The air in my office is quiet, focused, and completely devoid of drama. I am wearing a sharp navy blue tailored suit, sipping a freshly brewed espresso, and reviewing the quarterly earnings of my venture capital firm. The contrast between my serene reality and the chaotic nightmare my family is currently living could not be more poetic. The journey back to the United States had been an excruciating ordeal for them. Chad spent 2 agonizing weeks detained in a grim Italian holding facility while the extradition paperwork was processed. When he finally boarded a flight back to Chicago, he did not fly in the premium first-class cabin he felt so entitled to. He was seated in the very back row of a commercial economy flight, flanked by 2 armed United States Marshals wearing standard-issue gray sweatpants and heavy steel chains around his waist. His spectacular downfall played out exactly as Marcus and my legal team had predicted. When Chad was formally arraigned in federal court, the arrogant silver-tongued wealth manager was nowhere to be found. His prestigious financial firm had fired him the exact second the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided their corporate headquarters. His high-net-worth clients abandoned him, immediately scrambling to distance themselves from his toxic radioactive name. Because I had successfully frozen all of his assets, he could not afford to hire the aggressive, high-priced defense attorneys he desperately needed. He was forced to stand in front of a federal judge represented by an overworked public defender. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, including the forged trust documents, the stolen corporate credit card logs, and the explicit digital wire transfers to his personal shell company, Chad had absolutely no room to negotiate. He completely broke down in the courtroom. He accepted a comprehensive plea deal to avoid a devastating 20-year maximum sentence. The judge banged the gavel and sentenced him to a mandatory 5 years in federal prison for wire fraud and identity theft. In the federal prison system, there is no early parole for good behavior. He is going to sit in a concrete cell for every single day of those 5 long years, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his fabricated superiority. While Chad was being processed into the federal penitentiary system, Chloe was experiencing a brutal, uncompromising collision with reality. When she and my mother finally managed to scrape together enough money from distant, reluctant relatives to fly back from Italy, they took a cheap taxi straight to Big Mama House. They arrived exhausted, humiliated, and desperate for the familiar comfort of their suburban fortress. Instead, they found the bright red legal eviction notice permanently affixed to the front door, and their keys completely useless against the new electronic deadbolt. They were officially homeless. The golden child and the matriarch were forced to carry their heavy designer luggage to a cheap, run-down motel located right off the interstate. But the eviction was just the beginning of Chloe's nightmare. With Chad locked away and his financial records cracked wide open by federal investigators, the horrifying truth of his fake empire spilled out into the open. Chloe discovered that they possessed absolutely zero generational wealth. Chad had secretly taken out massive high-interest predatory loans just to maintain their fake lifestyle. Their bank accounts were not just empty, they were overdrawn by tens of thousands of dollars. 2 days after they returned to Chicago, repo men showed up at the motel in the middle of the night and towed away Chloe's luxury European SUV because Chad had not made a lease payment in 6 months. She was drowning in a toxic ocean of massive hidden debt. Driven by pure financial terror and the desperate need to distance herself from a convicted felon, Chloe filed for a rapid, uncontested divorce. She legally severed herself from Chad, but the emotional and social damage was permanent. Her wealthy socialite friends entirely cut her off. Her Instagram account, once a shrine to her vanity, was completely abandoned after being flooded with mocking comments from the viral cruise ship video. She was left entirely alone sitting in a cheap motel room with her 7-year-old son staring at a closet full of $2,000 designer handbags that she was now frantically trying to sell online just to buy basic groceries. I set my espresso cup down on my desk, my eyes scanning a complex legal contract when my personal cell phone suddenly vibrated. The screen lit up, displaying a notification. It was a text message from a number I had not blocked yet. It was Chloe. I picked up the phone and read the message. It was a massive, rambling block of text completely devoid of the mocking emojis and the cruel sarcasm she used to hurl at me. It was a message written by a woman who had finally been violently humbled by the universe. "Maya, please do not delete this," she wrote. "I am so sorry for everything. I mean it. I am sorry for how I treated you and Leo. Chad ruined my life. He lied to me about everything, and now I have absolutely nothing left. The state is threatening to take Mason away if I cannot prove I have a stable income and a safe place to live. Mom is working the night shift at a diner just to pay for our motel room. I have applied everywhere, but I have no degree and no real work experience. Nobody will hire me. Please, Maya. I know you own that massive firm. I will do anything. I will clean the bathrooms. I will take a janitorial job sweeping the floors of your building if it means I can buy food for my son. I am begging you to help me. Just this once, please." I read the long, desperate paragraph twice. I felt a brief passing flicker of sympathy for my nephew Mason. He was an innocent child caught in the crossfire of his parents' massive egos. I made a quiet mental note to have my attorneys set up an anonymous ironclad educational trust fund for him, entirely inaccessible to Chloe or Brenda, to ensure he would at least have a chance at college one day. But as for my sister, the woman who had proudly laughed when her mother told me to take my son to a public pool instead of a family vacation, the woman who had told me I was not built for the high life, she had made her bed with arrogance and cruelty, and now she was begging me to pull her out of the fire she had started. I did not type a single word in response. I did not offer her a job, and I certainly did not offer her forgiveness. I simply opened the message, ensuring the blue read receipt illuminated on her end of the screen. I wanted her to sit in that dingy motel room, staring at her phone, knowing with absolute certainty that I had seen her desperate plea. I wanted her to watch the minutes turn into hours, waiting for a lifeline that was never going to come. I left her on red. I locked my phone screen, tossed it casually into my leather briefcase, and turned my attention back to my empire. A massive Midwestern thunderstorm rolled into Chicago later that evening. The rain fell in heavy, unforgiving sheets, turning the city streets into dark, reflective rivers and violently thrashing against the thick glass of my corner office windows. I sat at my desk for a while, finishing my remaining paperwork, before finally packing up my leather briefcase. My phone had remained entirely silent for hours after I left Chloe on red. The silence was not a sign of acceptance or quiet reflection on her part. It was simply the breathless, panicked pause before a drowning person finally goes completely under the water. As I rode the private high-speed elevator down to the executive parking garage, my screen lit up with a new incoming call. It was not from my sister this time. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I let the phone ring in my hand as I stepped into the plush, climate-controlled interior of my chauffeured black SUV. I did not answer the call, but I instructed my driver to head toward the suburbs, to Big Mama's house. I knew exactly where they were, and I needed to see the final act of this tragedy with my own eyes to ensure the absolute finality of my decision. The drive took 45 minutes through the driving rain and heavy traffic. When my vehicle finally turned onto the familiar, quiet residential street, the scene waiting for me was almost cinematic in its sheer misery. If a camera were capturing this exact moment, it would execute a slow, dramatic push in through the pouring rain, focusing tightly on my mother's face. Brenda, the woman who had always meticulously maintained her appearance, who never stepped out of her house without flawless hair, expensive jewelry, and a condescending smile, looked completely and utterly destroyed. She was standing on the front porch of Big Mama's house, desperately seeking shelter under the small wooden awning, as the wind whipped the freezing rain sideways. Her expensive designer resort wear, the clothes she had bought specifically to flaunt on that $80,000 cruise, clung to her soaking wet body. Beside her, Chloe was sitting on one of their oversized, waterlogged suitcases. Her blonde extensions were matted to her skull, and she was shivering violently, clutching Mason tightly to her chest to keep him warm from the bitter wind. They were entirely locked out. The new high-security electronic deadbolt I had installed earlier that afternoon was an impenetrable glowing barrier. Taped dead center on the heavy wooden door, fluttering wildly in the storm, was the bright red legal eviction notice. It was a stark, undeniable symbol that her reign of terror over this family property was permanently over. I watched them from the tinted, soundproof windows of my SUV parked quietly at the curb across the street. My mother pulled her phone out of her wet pocket and redialed my number. This time I swiped the screen and answered. The sound of the violent thunderstorm instantly filled my car's Bluetooth audio system, accompanied by the ragged, pathetic sound of my mother sobbing. "Maya." "Please," Brenda cried into the receiver, her voice completely stripped of its usual haughty arrogance. "We are standing on the front porch. The locks are changed. There is a legal notice on the door saying we cannot go inside. It is freezing out here, Maya, and it is pouring rain. Mason is shivering. You cannot leave us out here in the dark like stray animals." I listened to her weeping, feeling the smooth leather of my seat beneath me. I did not say a single word, letting her desperate voice fill the quiet space of my car. "Please, just unlock the door remotely," Brenda begged, her tone shifting into a frantic, high-pitched plea. "Let us just sleep in the basement. We will not touch anything upstairs. I swear to you, we will stay out of your way." I know I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong about Chad, and I was wrong about you. You were right all along. Just give us the basement, Maya. Show a little mercy. It was the very first time in 34 years that I had ever heard my mother admit she was wrong. But the apology carried absolutely no weight. She was not apologizing because she felt genuine remorse for treating me like a second-class citizen my entire life. She was not apologizing for excluding my son from a family vacation or for parading Chad around as a superior human being while he committed federal fraud. She was apologizing because she was cold, wet, and locked out of the castle she thought she owned. Her remorse was nothing more than a desperate transaction to get back inside. I did not reply through the phone. I simply pressed the red button ending the call. I nodded to my driver, instructing him to pull the heavy SUV directly into the driveway. The thick tires crunched aggressively against the wet pavement. The bright LED headlights sweeping across the dark flooded lawn and illuminating the three miserable figures huddled on the porch. My mother gasped, dropping her phone onto the wet concrete as she recognized the vehicle. Chloe's head snapped up, a look of desperate, pathetic hope washing over her ruined, tear-stained face. They genuinely believed I had come to save them. They thought my physical arrival meant I had finally caved to the sacred, undeniable bond of family, that their tears had washed away decades of abuse, theft, and profound disrespect. I waited for my driver to step out, open my door, and hold a large black umbrella over my head. I stepped out of the warm, luxurious vehicle and into the freezing Midwestern storm. My tailored charcoal suit remained perfectly dry as I walked slowly up the concrete path. Brenda stumbled forward to the edge of the wooden porch stairs, her hands clasped tightly together against her chest as if she were praying to a deity. Maya, thank God, she cried, reaching a trembling hand out toward me into the rain. I knew you would not abandon your blood. I knew you had a good heart. Let us inside, please. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, keeping a calculated, deliberate distance between us. I did not step onto the porch. I did not offer her a comforting embrace or a warm smile. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper. I held out my hand, offering the document to her through the curtain of falling rain. Brenda reached out and took it with trembling, freezing fingers, looking down in absolute confusion. It was not a printed code for the electronic deadbolt. It was not a new lease agreement granting her permission to stay in the basement. It was a certified cashier's check made out to cash in the exact amount of $500. Brenda looked up at me, the rain plastering her ruined hair to her cheeks, her eyes wide with shock and devastating realization. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring thunder. I looked directly into her eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, unyielding resolve. The little girl who used to beg for her approval was completely gone, replaced by a woman who had built an empire from the bricks her family had thrown at her. I glanced briefly at my shivering nephew, knowing the money was solely to ensure he would not sleep on the street tonight, before locking eyes with my mother again. "This covers a motel for tonight," I said, my voice cutting cleanly and ruthlessly through the sound of the thunderstorm. "Tomorrow my lawyers press charges for trespassing." My mother stared at the small rectangular piece of paper in her trembling hands as if it were a physical weapon. The sheer reality of her situation finally shattered the last remaining fragments of her delusion. She looked at the $500, then looked up at the massive dark house that she had commanded for decades. The house she had traded away for a fleeting moment of social superiority. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The fragile, weeping victim act evaporated instantly, replaced by the vicious, cruel woman I had known my entire life. She crumpled the cashier check in her fist and lunged forward, her expensive soaked resort wear clinging to her as she screamed over the roaring thunder. "You have no heart!" she shrieked, her voice echoing violently against the brick facade of Big Mama House. "You are a cold, calculated monster. I am your mother. You are supposed to take care of me. You are supposed to protect your family, but instead you are throwing us out into the street like garbage. You have absolutely no heart, Maya." Chloe wailed from the porch, burying her face into her hands, completely shattered by the absolute finality of the moment. She did not even have the energy to hurl insults anymore. She just sat on her waterlogged designer suitcase, rocking back and forth in the freezing rain, finally understanding that her golden era was permanently over. I stood perfectly still on the wet concrete walkway. The freezing rain battered against the heavy black umbrella my driver held over my head, but I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no hesitation, no lingering sense of obligation to the woman screaming at me. For 34 years I had internalized her cruelty. I had bent over backward trying to earn a single drop of the affection she so freely showered on my sister and my fraudulent brother-in-law. I had convinced myself that I was broken, that I was somehow fundamentally unlovable. But standing here in the storm, watching her completely lose control, I finally saw her for exactly what she was. A small, bitter, deeply insecure woman who had used me as a punching bag to make herself feel powerful. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I did not need to. True power does not need to scream to be heard. I looked directly into her wild, furious eyes, maintaining a chilling, absolute calm. "You taught me that family has no room for useless people," I said smoothly, my voice slicing right through the howling wind and the torrential rain. "I am just applying your lesson. Goodbye." I did not wait for her response. I did not give her the satisfaction of a prolonged argument. I simply turned my back on her and began walking down the concrete path toward the waiting SUV. If a camera were capturing this final sequence, it would execute a slow, deliberate pullback. The lens would slowly retreat, capturing the vast, insurmountable emotional and physical distance that had just been permanently established between us. Brenda screamed my name again, a desperate guttural sound that tore through the storm, but I did not flinch. I did not break my stride. I did not look over my shoulder even once. I reached the vehicle and my driver opened the heavy door for me. I stepped up into the warm, quiet sanctuary of the leather interior, the heavy door slamming shut behind me, instantly cutting off the sounds of the storm and my mother's furious weeping. I settled into my seat and pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. I opened my contacts list. I navigated to my mother number, scrolled to the bottom of the screen, and pressed block. I did the exact same thing for Chloe. I navigated to my email accounts and created a permanent filter, sending any communication from them directly to the trash folder. I completely severed every single digital and physical tie binding me to their toxicity. The engine of the SUV purred to life. The vehicle smoothly pulled away from the curb, its red taillights glowing brightly in the dark, rain-swept street. Through the rear window, my strong silhouette remained perfectly still as the house and the weeping figures on the porch slowly faded into the distance. They were completely engulfed by the shadows, and the storm left to face the brutal consequences of their own arrogance. The cycle of abuse was permanently broken. The purge was complete. 2 weeks later, the relentless Chicago thunderstorms had given way to the boundless, brilliant blue of the stratosphere. I was reclining in the plush, cream-colored leather seat of a Gulfstream private jet cruising smoothly at 40,000 feet. The low, steady hum of the engines was the only sound in the immaculate cabin. There was no screaming. There were no frantic demands for money. There were no toxic comparisons or heavy sighs of disappointment. There was just absolute, uninterrupted peace. Sitting in the oversized captain chair directly across from me was Leo. He was completely engrossed in a massive, colorful tourist map of Tokyo, his little fingers eagerly tracing the intricate subway lines and pointing out the different historical districts. We were currently flying over the Pacific Ocean, heading straight for Japan. This trip was his promised reward for bringing home that perfect straight-A report card. He did not need an $80,000 cruise ticket to a floating shopping mall surrounded by people who viewed his very existence as a disruption. He was getting an immersive global adventure with the one parent who recognized exactly how brilliant and worthy he truly was. I watched him enthusiastically circle the location of a famous robotics museum with a bright red marker. Seeing the pure, unfiltered joy on his face validated every single harsh decision I had made over the past month. When you grow up as the designated scapegoat of a narcissistic family, you are conditioned to believe that setting boundaries is an act of supreme selfishness. You are taught that you must endure endless disrespect simply because the people hurting you happen to share your bloodline. But that is the biggest lie they sell you to keep you under their control. I turned my attention away from my son and looked directly into the camera lens, breaking the invisible barrier between my reality and yours. If you are watching this right now and you are exhausted from fighting for a seat at a table where you are constantly being starved, I need you to hear this. Stop begging them to see your value, take your energy, take your brilliance, and build your own table entirely. The sweetest revenge isn't watching them fall. It is realizing they no longer have the clearance to exist in your world. I reached across the wide aisle. Leo looked up from his map, a massive bright smile lighting up his entire face. He picked up his crystal glass filled with fresh ice-cold orange juice and held it out toward me. I raised my own flute of perfectly chilled vintage champagne. The delicate crystal glasses met in the quiet air of the cabin, producing a sharp, clear, and incredibly satisfying clink. I leaned back against my seat, offering a final deeply fulfilled smile as I turned my gaze toward the window. The camera smoothly pans away from my face, gliding toward the thick oval glass, capturing the endless unbroken expanse of the bright blue sky before slowly fading to black.